We're live. Thank you everybody for joining us for another C-Lab event. My name is Amanda Barton. I am one of the co-presidents along with Eric Stevens. We're so happy to have you all attend today. We have a great panel for you. First, I'd like to give a big shout out and thank the event sponsor for tonight, which is HBK Cannabis Solutions. They offer tax and advisory services for companies in the cannabis space and the surrounding ancillary businesses as well. I also want to give a huge shout out to Akerman. They have really been helping us out this month. Zachary Kobrin, who is our moderator for tonight's panel. He is a special counsel with Akerman. And we also have Ari Gerstein, who definitely helped out last week in leading a panel we had with doctors. It was amazing. So thank you guys for all your efforts and supportive leadership within Cannabis Lab. We really appreciate it. For everybody that's all the attendees on the call tonight, please put your contact information and share details down in the chat feature. We'd love to get some networking going on, and feel free to also drop any questions you might have in the Q&A section. At the end of the event, we will be taking and fielding some questions from the audience. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Zach.
Well, thank you, Amanda, and thank you everyone for jumping on as well to the fantastic panel we have. Today, we're gonna have a conversation about a really interesting topic that I think everyone thinks they know a little bit about. But the group we have here knows more than most in the industry, and we're going to kind of hopefully fill everyone in on the ins and outs of banking and financial services, which isn't as big of an oxymoron as you think within the cannabis industry. As Amanda said, my name is Zach Kobrin. I'm an attorney at Akerman. I specialize in cannabis law, dealing with marijuana and hemp companies across the country, corporate regulatory practice. But we kind of provide services to a number of clients, large and small, ancillary businesses, etc. Today, we are extremely fortunate to have Tyler Beuerlein. I'm always going to butcher your last name, Tyler. I apologize.
All right, used to it.
Tyler's the Chief Revenue Officer for Hypur. Hypur is one of the leading financial services providers and consultants within the cannabis industry. Tyler has extensive experience in building brands, managing key relationships, strategic partnerships. He's been at the forefront of Hypur's expansion, especially over the last 5 years, where him and his experience, he touches on financial institutions, government officials, regulatory bodies, all within and around the state and legal cannabis industry, and even on the federal level. So from that, he's got this intricate knowledge that he possesses for banking and regulatory climate. He currently serves as the chair of the NCIA, the National Cannabis Industry Association's Banking and Financial Services Committee. He's also a member of the Forbes Business Development Council. And for those that are friends of his online, you'll see that he frequently publishes articles or is quoted when it comes to banking or merchant services or payment processing in the cannabis industry. He previously founded and managed a large beverage company prior to joining Hypur. And I think he would, I'd be remiss if I didn't also say he's a former professional athlete. So if you know Tyler, he's a huge baseball fan. So, I can't really say I'm a Mets fan though, but it's okay.
Yeah.
We've also got Dana Chaves, who is the Senior VP, and again, I will butcher all these last names, so I apologize for everybody. Senior VP at one of the leading cannabis banks, one of the leading banks in the country providing cannabis services in First Federal, which is based here in Florida. She's the Director of Specialty Banking Relations, where she has basically, coming in from Colorado, then to Florida, Dana has built a strategic banking and financial and legislative relationships throughout the entire cannabis industry, and has essentially built First Federal's cannabis banking platform. She is one of the leaders in the industry and one of the most knowledgeable people when it comes to the banking industry as it pertains to the cannabis sector, and not just marijuana, but also hemp as well. Dana has worked to expand banking services for the financial institutions she works for in multiple markets that she's worked in, not just Florida and Colorado, but across the United States. Previously, she taught financial literacy courses at Johnson & Wales University, as well as CU Denver. She's also she was a partner at on the Partner Colorado Foundation, raising funds for education. Wow, I didn't know this. Dana traveled the United States. She traveled with the U.S. State Department and the Department of Energy on worldwide energy trading missions, working on renewable energy programs. As long as I know her, I can attest to the fact that she enjoys advocating for causes that mean a great deal to her, not just the cannabis industry. And she previously, I think immediately prior to Tyler, served as chair of the NCIA Banking Access Committee. And through that role in her position, she's authored numerous position papers and white papers, advising and directing on financial institutions and state regulatory agencies. We're lucky to have her as well. And last but certainly not least, we have Michael Aguirre, who is the Assistant General Counsel with Harvest Health and Recreation, who, as many will know, watching, Harvest is one of the largest multi-state cannabis operators in the country, publicly traded in Canada, but based in Arizona, as well as, I lost count how many states you guys are in. Michael, who is spent 14 years as an international at Greenberg and Trorg, handling public and private company, doing corporate work in a wide range of industries, including various financial institutions, private lenders, private equity firms, and portfolio companies. He used to formerly provide a general representation of businesses, entity formation, corporate representation, governance, and the like. He's a member of the Los Abogados Hispanic Bar Association and the selection committee for the Cesar Chaves Leadership Institute, his alma mater, Arizona State University. In June of 2019, correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, he joined Harvest, where he serves now as their Assistant General Counsel. We are extremely fortunate to have him here as well, especially providing the perspective on our topics for an operator. So as everyone watching can tell, we have a fantastic panel with a multitude of experience across the industry. And so I want to kind of jump right in if we can, and hopefully have an open conversation with everybody. But the first thing I think we'll talk about, if we didn't jump right in, is talk about the Safe Banking Act. Many have heard about it, kind of know sort of what it is. Tyler, I know I've heard you speak a great deal about it. Why don't you kind of give us an idea of what the Safe Banking Act is, and is it going to actually have a meaningful impact in this cannabis community?
Yeah, the SAFE Act has gotten a lot of publicity, obviously, in our space. And there's been so much information put out about what it would do for the industry. And it will have some very positive effects on the industry, but I think people miss a couple of key things. And first and most glaring is this industry's banked. The publications or the media outlets that are out there saying that this is a giant cash crisis and there's no banking for the industry, that's false. If you had gone back, 6.5 years ago when we started, yes, it was a pretty big problem, but, as Dana can attest to, you had the partner Colorado credit unions of the world come out and really try and solve the problem. And now operators not only have options in their state, but they have an increasing number of options. So the notion that this is some massive crisis, I think is a little misrepresented. The second, I would say, misrepresentation or piece of misinformation that's out there is that every bank and credit union is just going to jump in to bank the space. And what I tell people is, if you look at other industries that are perfectly legal, that have been essentially shut out of the banking system because they pose a regulatory compliance challenge to any bank or credit union trying to bank them, it's very similar on the cannabis side. This is a highly regulated industry. It's always going to have a cash component. And as a result, if a bank or credit union does not have the regulatory compliance framework or program, and Dana can attest to this with First Federal, they've built a very robust team and compliance program to bank this industry efficiently. And regulatory bodies are not going to lessen their expectation for institutions wanting to bank this space if the SAFE Act passes. So the notion that Chase and B of A are coming into this, the day after it passes, I think is very misguided. And I think you're still going to see a very limited number of institutions willing to enter this market. Another item that has been really misrepresented, I've actually seen operators send out communication to their member base saying, hey, call up your congressperson and say you want the SAFE Act so we can offer credit cards. That's not the case. The branded card networks will not enter this market until federal legality, period. Anybody offering credit cards has essentially committed fraud to do so. We've seen the litigation, we've seen the fallout. There's a lot to avoid when you're talking about the payment world, and we'll get to that later.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into that payment side.
Oh yeah, it's squirrely. The one thing a couple things the SAFE Act will do. It'll really open up lending, which would be great for the industry. It also gives the FFIEC 180 days to come out with additional guidance to examiners. So what people fail to realize also is the only guidance for examiners or institutions is the 2014 FinCEN guidance, which is very light. Okay, so examiners have had to learn, just like the banks and credit unions banking in the industry, and just like the industry, of how to examine institutions that want to bank this. And that's been part of the challenge over the years. Now that's changed dramatically over the last few, but those things will really help the industry long term.
Now, Dana, let me ask you. So, we know a little bit about the Safe Banking Act in the sense of what it just, what it may or may not do. But from a banker's perspective, what do the banks think of the Safe Banking Act? Will it provide the coverage that banks need to really jump in, or do they think more is needed? What's the bank's perspective?
Well, Zach, like Tyler just mentioned, banks aren't going to rush into the industry because the SAFE Act passes. It just makes us feel, those of us who are banking the industry, makes us feel safer for doing so. And as Tyler also said, it will open up the ability to offer lending component to the industry. And so that's what we're looking for.
So moving on kind of from the Safe Banking Act, I think one thing that's kind of, and Tyler, you kind of hit on it, that, and I know we've talked about this offline, and Dana, we've talked about it, in all the various, or times we've ever spoken, but that, there are banks banking in this industry. And, those that say they can't find a bank, and I know we've joked about it, they don't know the right people. Because to say that you can't find a bank, there are banks, it's just knowing which banks will do it and whether or not you're willing to comply with what the banks are looking for, right? Because it's not like your normal, hey, I'm walking down the street to B of A, I'm going to open up a checking account. So I guess, Dana, from your perspective, from a bank side, that are actually servicing the cannabis industry, kind of tell us a little bit specifically, like, what are the banks looking for in clients? Like, what are some client misconceptions really regarding the initial and ongoing compliance? Because I know from talking to you, yeah, I mean, people will think, oh, why do I have to pay these fees if my normal SunTrust fee account is $25 a month or whatever it is, or why do I have to, allow my bank to come in and inspect my books? All the various things that may go into a compliance program. What are some of the things that you guys from a bank expect, so people watching can understand, hey, if I need a bank, I should be expecting these things?
Well, a lot of people do understand the compliance issue. We always joke, this isn't the cannabis industry, this is the compliance industry. And it is very true. The better your compliance program, the more successful that a bank will be. And therefore, compliance is expensive. And so that's what raises the fees, because we have to make sure that we're able to monitor every transaction. And so when you go to open up an account, the misnomer is that you can go into a branch and open an account the same day.
Right.
That's not true. our process for one due diligence, depending on the the complexity of the organizational structure, can take a minimum of 3 to 4 weeks just for one application for the due diligence. So you go in to a bank, you have to make sure that you don't need it right tomorrow or yesterday. We all understand the urgency and the need for a bank account immediately. And so it does take time, and there are fees, and we do require a lot of paperwork. We drill down to the very owner of each account, beneficial ownership.
Yeah. And you know, I think it may be important, and you know, something we kind of bridge to Michael with this, but you know, Dana, for you, I guess 2 questions. One, is there a difference between the way a bank, you know, considers whether or not to take an account for a hemp company compared to a marijuana company? You know, and then, you know, also, what are the things that would be red flags, right? That you would say, nope, we can't, we got to really either ask for more diligence, or we can't really take that company's accounts?
Well, first of all, just because hemp and CBD have been deemed federally legal doesn't make them less compliant driven. So FinCEN has put out guidance for the industry on due diligence and the requirements banks need to have for hemp businesses. So there's still a lot of licensing, permitting. We pay attention to make sure everything is valid, everything is legal, and everything is up to date.
And for those that don't know, FinCEN is it's a branch of the Department of Treasury. It's the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. And they basically are the ones that put out regulatory guidance for financial institutions, not just in cannabis, but in any aspect. You know, so when, you know,
but we do treat cannabis clients and our hemp clients separately. The fees are a little different, and the due diligence process for hemp clients is not as intrusive as it is for cannabis clients, but it's still intrusive, time consuming, and fee involved.
Right. Now, I guess, Michael, from your perspective, and you know, I want to touch on, I know stuff that you've got a great deal of experience on with regards to lending next, but kind of before we touch on that, I kind of want to pivot off of what Dana was saying. You know, from an operator's perspective, you know, Harvest is one of the largest companies, you know, multiple states. You know, how do you interpret, or how do you view your, you know, banking relationships? You know, is it the type of thing where Harvest values the fact that they need to have multiple banks or one bank, or, you know, is it the type of thing, you know, what are the things that you're looking for in a bank, so to speak, for your account services?
Sure. I'll touch on a few things. I mean, you know, obviously, when we look at it, we know that the industry is banked, but for a company like ours, you know, what we look for is, does it have the capabilities of the things that we need as a multi-state operator? And that's really where I think we start to run into lack of availability or some challenges. You know, one thing that might seem obvious is just technology. Some of the banks that we've used, because, and let me make the point that this is not unique to the banking industry. I mean, across service providers in general, I think, you know, there are different levels of availability of service providers. And so we run into this, not just with banking, but, you know, with law firms, with insurance companies across the board. And so you start to see what is the sophistication level of the people that have entered the market, and how is that changing over time? What are the capabilities that they have? And so something as simple as a bank that has the ability for us to get on an online platform and pull up our bank accounts across, you know, multiple account numbers, you know, sometimes that doesn't exist. And so it just makes tracking things much more challenging in ways that, you know, when you are with larger, more established or national banks, those things are, you know, just expected. You know, because the banking opportunities have been relatively local, you know, for a multi-state operator like Harvest, you know, you are opening accounts in multiple jurisdictions, and you don't have kind of the national umbrella where you have one one provider that you can go to, and it's seamless for you. And that creates a challenge because, you know, it's banking from a company's standpoint, you really want that bank to be a partner. And a longtime partner for you. You want to build that relationship. And so having to have it be more kind of a one-off or on a transactional basis as opposed to implementing services across the board, you know, those are things that you can find the bank, but it doesn't make it easy for you to operate your business. I mean, that's really the next level that a company like Harvest is looking for.
So, you know, well, I guess kind of continuing that line or that thought, you know, what are some things that maybe, you know, that operators, whether you are a, you know, small operator in California that has a small grow, or you're a big multi-state, what are some things that maybe companies don't realize or is important to understand? Hey, these are the steps, these are the operations, these are the, you know, these are the things that we have to do internally as an operator to make getting access to better banking, or to those, you know, to those banks that have the technology services, that have all the services suites that you want. What are some of the things that an operator can do to kind of implement to say, make it easier for them, you know, from your perspective? Let's say to you, Michael, what do you think?
Sorry, what could make it easier?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I think for us, it's really more variety where you can, you know, you have the ability to see, and this, again, it's true across a lot of industries, but you have, you know, national banks that you can take advantage of that might fit what you can do and create efficiencies within the organization, because right now it's just a piecemeal patchwork of banking relationships, and that, you know, again, if you're a local operator, that may work very well for you, but as a multi-state operator, the ability to have some of the larger providers and larger banks that can do multi-state work and pull that off because they've done it before for other companies is a pretty critical thing that we're looking for the next step.
So when it comes to, you know, banking and financial services, it's not just your everyday account services. You know, it's not just where your money is sitting, but, you know, for the cannabis industry, there's a whole nother side of the financial industry that's huge. And we touched on it a little bit, but Michael, it'd be really good to talk about, that's the money side, you know, because of the legalities within cannabis on a federal level, you can't go to B of A or JP Morgan and, you know, get a $10 million credit facility, right? You know, so finding access to capital is a difficult thing. I know that's some of the things that you've worked on, but, you know, Michael, from your perspective, what are some of the issues that maybe cannabis companies face when it comes to that financing and lending issues? You know, and you know, what are the ways that you're looking to kind of circumvent that?
Yeah, I mean, the first and biggest one is just cost of capital. I mean, you know, it's from, you know, for the cannabis industry, you know, the rates are just so much higher than any other industry because it you know, it's acknowledgement of some of those legality issues that you reference and just the general risk of the industry.
To borrow money is what you're saying.
To borrow money, right? The interest rates are much higher than you would see in most industries, and so that's just the cost of doing business. And until there's you know, more until there's legality, until there's you know, more open lending environment, that's going to continue to be the case, and that's just going to be the world that we live in. You know, some of the things that I think were unique to me is, I use the word relationship again. I mean, you know, companies often build strong relationships with their banks that are providing those services to them, and they often become the lenders. And there's, you know, familiarity with the company, with its operations, with management, and all those things that make it a seamless transition into providing capital to a company. We don't really have those opportunities with banks, and, you know, in the first place, we probably don't have those relationships built with our existing, you know, depository banks. But then they're not also able to be the ones that are providing capital to us. And so it's a constant re-education process for for us as we work with people that maybe aren't as invested in the company because they're not longtime partners. They may not be aware of how multi-state operators operate. And so it's you know, it's everything from you know, who's drawn into the industry and how that, you know, they're looking to make their money, to trying to educate people on the fly. And so one of the things that was, you know, has kind of been interesting for me is depending on the sophistication level of people and sometimes lack of sophistication level that are in the industry, I often provide and providing you know, trying not to provide legal services to the lender, but often find myself in a situation where I'm having to educate them because they're not knowledgeable about the business, the industry, things like that. And that would be different if you had more institutional lenders that were used to the space, they're in the space, and they're providing it on a regular basis. And so, you know, those are things that just complicate, you know, our ability to raise capital. And there's a whole host of other things, but those are some of the big ones.
You know, for a company like Harvest, obviously, you know, for you guys to access capital and access money, you know, you're looking to, you know, raise funds on a completely different level than, you know, the smaller mom and pop companies. You know, Tyler, I know that's something that Hypur is, you know, that you've worked on a little bit with Hypur, getting, you know, also into the, you know, lending and financing side. You know, are you seeing more companies, and by companies, I mean more financial institutions, more lenders, more private equity funds? You know, are you seeing more entities jumping in, especially looking to provide, I don't want to call them microloans, but providing smaller level loans instead of the $10 to $20 million, hey, $500,000, $1 million. You know, are you seeing more opportunities in the cannabis industry, or is it still something that, you know, because when I talk to businesses, you know, it's almost like there's no middle ground, right? There's the really large companies that need a lot of capital, right? They need, you know, that 7 figures plus. And then there's the smaller ones just starting out that maybe just need $500,000 or at most $1 million, right? To retrofit a grow or do something, you know, with their 1 or 2 dispensaries. I've never really seen them, right? So I guess, Tyler, are you seeing more, you know, more access, more entities trying to jump in? Because like from what Michael was talking about, it presents an interesting dynamic that some people just don't understand the dynamic of lending in the cannabis industry. So I'm curious your take on that.
Yeah, we've seen a number of groups come in. So it's a mix of financial institutions. There are some that are lending in very specific areas with specific operators they bank for years and feel very comfortable with. In the cannabis space, because it's still federally illegal, you've got a perfection of capital issue that is the reason why most financial institutions won't lend to the industry. But we have a venture capital firm that runs alongside Hypur, and we've actually been active. And what we've seen is a lot of the multi-state operators have had to go out and buy portfolios of properties in cash because they either had to close on a property in a short amount of time, they had a lot of competition. And so as the liquidity crunch occurred in the public markets, they've had to go now create liquidity through real estate debt. And so I think from a private money lending perspective, and that's what I did in a previous life, there's no better time than now to provide that capital, especially if you can get in that, 10 to 12 sweet spot. I think that makes a lot of sense for large operators and small operators alike on real estate. The risk for investors is extremely low because in most cases they're lending at less than 60% of cost to these people to provide them the liquidity. And if you can put them into 3 to 5 year notes, I think it makes a lot of sense. So the Harvest of the world can take advantage of market conditions, go in and gobble up assets in either new licensed markets or some of the operators that have fallen into the distressed category. So yeah, we've seen a huge influx of new capital for that.
Now, I think what a lot of people don't actually realize when it comes to lending in the industry is, you go to a bank and you borrow money, you buy a house, you get a mortgage, right? And you put something up as collateral, security, your assets, right? So when you get a mortgage, the property itself, that's your collateral. And what a lot of people don't realize is, when you're a large company and you go out and you borrow money from a financial institution, you as well have to have collateral. And so, Tyler, you kind of touched on the real estate side. And I think what a lot of people also don't realize is in the cannabis industry, your most valuable asset, you can't securitize it. You can't put that up as collateral in most instances because of the regulatory framework that's in place. if you are a Harvest in the world, being able to say, well, I'm going to put my license in Florida and Arizona and any other state I operate in up as collateral, yeah, you can probably do that, but it's probably with regulator approval and a whole host of other things that lenders don't want to deal with. So, beyond, what we've seen real estate, are there any other, I guess, and I'll throw it out to the group, real estate's kind of become the sexy lending segment, right? Because that's fixed assets that you can, you can do a sale leaseback. You can get a company that's going to buy a property off of you and you can use that. But are there other kind of asset-based areas that, maybe I'll throw it out to the whole group, that we're seeing lenders being willing to securitize beyond the license itself or real estate? Is there anything else that we're seeing?
A couple things. Factoring, seen a lot of people come in for factoring, seen a lot of people come in to try and finance equipment. But one of the most interesting examples of this is California recently launched a state initiative for PPE loans for the industry. And there's one bank that kind of headed up the effort, and they put out multiple loans at prime plus one.
Right.
And they were significantly sized. So that's the first time I've seen something like that, obviously, but certainly good for the industry. And needless to say, those operators are, extremely excited to get access to capital like that.
I see Dana's eyes going up like, I want to know more about this.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, Zach, I think you hit it on the head. That the collateral issue is a huge one. Even in those jurisdictions where licenses as collateral is permitted, my point earlier about in an educational standpoint, that's only one half of the equation for a lender. They're going to look at whether they can get the license as collateral, but perhaps the bigger question is on the back end is how could they enforce their security interest? And,
right.
There's just not, the industry is not old enough really to have case law on that, or how courts or particular states are going to look at it. So, even in those states where an industry says, or the regulatory body says, yes, you can grant a license on the front end without our consent, or we're allowing it, you have to get our consent on the back end. And, and that's really only been tested. The change of control has been tested in a M&A context, but not quite so much on a foreclosure or a sale out of a default for a lender. And so, that's a real barrier that lenders obviously have to get over, and borrowers have to help them understand. But I think, until there's a little bit more development in the case law, there's obviously, there's uncertainty in the bankruptcy courts. So all of the traditional remedies that the lenders would be looking at, are not, they are not available to them. And so, that does create a lot of uncertainty, and banks don't like uncertainty.
Right. And it's the perfect kind of pivot to you just very briefly, Dana, because that uncertainty, I think a lot of people don't realize, especially, folks I've talked to where they say, well, the cannabis industry is, making money hand over fist. Why wouldn't banks want to get into it? And they don't realize, I guess, from a bank's perspective, whether it's just offering account services or even lending, both things I know that you know very well, how much risk is really involved for these banks, whether it's, regulators coming after them or being able to, securitize their investment. I mean, can you just touch on that aspect from a bank's perspective so people understand how much risk is really at play here? And what's a risk to First Federal, if someone defaults on a loan, or if, someone, is in having investors send money in through their accounts that, don't pass KYC, anti-money laundering, things like that. What's the risk to you as the bank?
There's a significant amount of risk, and keep in mind, First Federal launched our program April of last year. So even though I've been in the industry for several years, First Federal is still fairly new to the industry, even though we've come a long way since April of last year. We do look at some lending, financing opportunities as far as real estate, but it's very limited and it's on a case-by-case basis because of the risk, and also because of the risk, we have extreme limitations on what we will look at. So, you know, we will not do property without a building. We will only do a building, but only if there's multiple tenants in there, where the cannabis tenant is less than 50% of the mortgage. That way we can cover the risk a little better, but even still, that's on a case-by-case basis.
So,
Can I chime in on
yeah,
that?
go ahead.
One of the things that I tell the operators, that we've tried to send operators to the appropriate institution for years as a service to the industry. And I'll have operators constantly call me and say, well, that bank seemed very difficult. Why are they asking for these things? And not only is the bank charter on the line, but also Dana is an officer of the financial institution. If something went wrong, she could have a civil money penalty imposed on her personally that couldn't be covered by the insurance policy of the financial institution. So everybody has risk here. And I always tell operators, be thankful that they're asking those things, because if they're not going to be banking the industry very long, and you're going to get a call in the next 30 to 90 days and your accounts are going to be shut off. So embrace those things and understand.
Yeah, it's funny when you talk about that, because I know one of the things that we've always joked about is, you know, and that I've told clients is, look, when you're in the cannabis industry, there's two people that you are going to be the most honest with, no questions asked. It's going to be your lawyer and your banker. You know, and if your banker needs to know everything under the sun, you tell them that. Why? Because the last thing you want is your money to be sitting there and not have access to it. So, you know, we've talked about cannabis banking and account services, and we've talked about lending, two of the bigger issues. And I kind of want to pivot to an issue that I know is extremely important to you, Tyler, especially with what Hypur does. I also know it's really important to guys like Todd Rosales, who are, you know, trying to become experts when it comes to this, when it comes to payment processing versus merchant services, right? You know, Tyler, you touched on it before when it comes to, you know, the major credit card providers, but maybe kind of tell us what's the difference between payment processing and merchant services?
I think there's a lot of similarities between the two, but when you're talking about payment processing, that can be really any modality. So like Hypur, you know, essentially provides payments to the industry. Our financial institutions process those on behalf of the ecosystem. So when a transaction is run with Hypur, our financial institutions move the money from the consumer's bank account directly into the merchants.
Right.
And so I think that's a very important distinction. When you get into other payment modalities, you're talking about branded card networks. You're talking about, you know, fraudulent models. And I know we touched on earlier, but anybody running credit cards in this space unequivocally has committed fraud to do so. And if you've seen the way things have played out in the state of California, not only have providers gotten hit really hard, not only from you know, I'm going to say an outreach and reputational perspective, but also the Department of Justice just got involved with a really big case in California along those lines. And I think that's going to continue. And my bigger concern now today is the use of cashless and reverse ATMs. And the industry seems to think that they're permissible and they're going to be here forever. They're not. They're just as fraudulent at the end of the day. And one of the interesting aspects of it is I'm seeing technology providers partner with providers of these services. They're raising money based off the transaction revenue of that partnership. And I think we're going to see some fallout from the investor side, because if I'm putting money into a company based on revenues that are being represented to me, and that modality is fraudulent, it's going to be shut off. Right. You know, there's going to be some there's going to be some blood in the streets, unfortunately.
So let's kind of scale it down for everybody so you kind of understand, right? So you've got the, like you said, use the word modality, right? There's different types of payment processing modalities, right? You've got merchant services, which I would say directly, hey, you walk up to a register and they've got a nice Visa or an Amex sticker there, and they'll process your card like you would at any department store, right? And then payment processing are these various different modalities that will literally facilitate a transaction. In some ways, those could be a lot of, I'm not going to mention it, like, you know, companies where you set up an account, you put funds in the account, and you go to your dispensary, and you give them that, you know, that club or that company number, your membership number, or your card, and they automatically deduct it. Others, you have some kind of financial technology that acts as a middle technology, bridging the gap, just facilitating the transaction between one to the next, but not actually underwriting the value or like you would see with a credit card company. Cashless ATMs is a modality, I'd say, that we're seeing more and more. And I'm not taking any position on it because I want to have an interesting conversation. But like I've seen a lot of people say, well, you know what, it is allowed, and some people say, no, it isn't allowed. But you know, Tyler, you touched on it. What is cashless ATM? You know, in the simplest form, what would you say cashless ATM is?
Cashless ATM is a terminal that sits on a counter. When a consumer runs a transaction with their debit card, it's being represented to the acquiring bank that it's a physical ATM on site, but it's being used at the point of purchase for products. So they'll ring the transaction up in a round number, let's say $80. And let's say the transaction is a $75 transaction. They'll give the consumer $5 cash back. So it falls in line with the ATM restrictions. But again, it's a fraudulent model, and I think we're going to see some carnage in the industry as a result.
Now, for cashless ATMs, you need a bank. A bank's got to be backstopping those transactions, correct?
Yep. A bank's got to be backstopping the transactions, but it's also still using a network. So if I'm using a Visa MasterCard for that withdrawal, that's problematic to the branded card network. So you've got some real issues there from a legal perspective. And again, you know, I know that hammer's going to fall. So
Dana, as a bank, you know, if you've got client operators that are like, are you looking at the various modalities that they're using for payment processing, whether they're using a Hypur or they're using, you know, CanPay or any of the other companies, or they're using cashless ATM? I mean, are you looking at those things and taking it into consideration?
Definitely.
And what would be a red flag?
Well, they have to get approval from us first, and there's only, I'd say, 2 that we have approved right now, and Tyler can attest to some of the more preferred payment systems that are available, which is why, you know, banks are looking at ways, but they have to get approval from us if they want to use a certain payment provider.
Sure. Now, I guess Michael from
Zach, real quick, I'll just say
go ahead.
This is a banking problem, not a payments problem. And what I mean by that is, if a bank or credit union cannot solve the regulatory compliance issues to bank this industry, the payment modality is never going to survive, because those transactions originate and settle through banks and credit unions. And so everybody that's trying to attack this from a payment perspective is completely missing the boat. And that's why, you know, we affectionately refer to it as whack-a-mole in our building, because in 6.5 years, I mean, I've probably seen 100 different payment providers come and go, and they leave, you know, a trail of tears in the process. But, you know, just something I wanted to share, because I think it's relevant.
No, and I think that's a good point, because we saw a lot on and it kind of bridges into the stuff you've talked about a lot, Dana, with the compliance, and, you know, especially on the CBD side. You know, a year ago, a large provider, you know, that was opening up accounts too quickly decided to, you know, stop on a dime. And a lot of that was because they were owned by a larger, more traditional, you know, blue chip bank. And, you know, some felt that they were moving too fast. And, you know, especially the CBD companies that are making, you know, a lot of money very quickly in online transactions, you know, had to find new ways for their payment processing, especially for online transactions. So I think you raise a really valid point there, Tyler, that, you know, the banks and the regulators have to figure out a way to make these transactions work. You know, it's almost like, you know, if, you know, it's like virus protection. There's always going to be the next virus to go around whatever the protection is, and then there's always going to be the next virus protection to solve that virus. So, you know, in the cannabis industry, it's kind of that cyclical model where there's always going to be some company that's going to be able to, you know, bridge the gap. But until we fix the larger problem, you know, I don't think that there's going to be a clear, consistent answer. You know, Michael, and I know that and I want to, and I'm trying to go as fast as I can because I want to leave time because I think we got a lot of questions. But Michael, let me kind of ask you from an operator's perspective. What are some of the things that maybe Harvest is doing that operators can do to kind of help facilitate these transactions more than just cash? I mean, I know the bulk of these transactions are still very much cash, but are there things that Harvest maybe is doing to help facilitate, either working with other payment processing services or kind of membership? I don't know, just some things that maybe Harvest is working on that you kind of glean some light into.
Yeah, it's not an area that I have a lot of experience, so I won't be able to provide a whole lot. I mean, I do know that we're constantly looking at different ways that we can make the process easier. I mean, and that's for us and for customers. I mean, it's a difficult thing on both sides of the equation, and so I know there's some work ongoing to figure out how you can introduce credit cards legally into the space and what that will look like. But it just highlights the real challenges, right? Is in almost any other industry, you're not spending time, resources, money figuring these things out. But here you have to, and you have to in a space that's emerging, with companies, as Tyler pointed out, so they come and go, trying to figure out which is the right horse to bet on, where you devote your capital. All of those things are real challenges, right? And unfortunately, it's just, you're just waiting for the speed of things to move a little bit faster so that we can get to something a little more certain. All the while you're just, I think whack-a-mole is probably a thing for operators too, where, we're just trying to piece it together in a way that makes sense. And that ultimately is holding a lot of things back.
How much would you say is trial and error, so to speak? Try one thing, if it doesn't work, move on. Try the next thing. Especially in an industry where technology is changing daily. Regulations are changing daily. How much, from the operator's perspective, is just trial and error? What works, what doesn't work? Keep moving.
Yeah, I can't say specifically on this, but I mean, I would say that just my experience in general and in talking with others in the industry is it's not unique to the banking space, but there's a lot of trial and error because, you don't have access to traditional advisors in a lot of ways too that can help you through these things because the advisors are still on the sideline. And so there's a lot of things that you're trying to figure out on your own. Or working with people that aren't as established as you might hope, and so there's just there's a lot. I would say it's a fair amount without any specific examples. I would think it's a fair amount.
Michael, you touched on a really interesting point there with the advising. Dana, as a banker, how much? I hate to use the term hand-holding, but how much are you an advisor more as much as you are a bank executive? How much hand-holding are you having to provide these companies so they understand what to do and what not to do?
I work with my compliance team, my BSA department. We review those expectations with our clients every time that we come up with a new interview for potential customers. So we're constantly letting them know what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and the way that we would like to have things done for our compliance. And so our clients end up calling us all the time and saying, well, we're looking at this, what do you think? And then we have to do our own investigation and due diligence on that entity, so that, sorry about that, so that we feel comfortable with the compliance aspect on that.
Tyler, I know consulting and providing that kind of guidance is something Hypur does and that you guys do, but kind of give us some insight, like, how much of what you guys work on is not just, Hypur the technology, but Hypur the consulting services, and are we looking at, you working with banks, or you working with actual companies?
Yeah, you know, been kind of thrown in. We've gotten so far down the rabbit hole that, you know, I think I've helped most MSOs lay out their banking relationships throughout the country. Um, I don't even know how many people to their banking relationships on the national level, because we know who's banking what where. And regardless of what FinCEN publishes, we believe that that universe is still less than 50 institutions in the country truly banking this industry to scale. So you know, we help with banks and credit unions. We help the industry find relationships. We help the industry, you know, try and do things the right way. We obviously help on the payment side, but then even, you know, regulatory bodies and state and federal government officials, I mean, they call and they want to know information that's not readily available anywhere in the public markets, or at least not accurately. And so, you know, it's become a really unique seat at the table over the last 6.5 years, and very fortunate to be here. But
Yeah.
kind of touch everything.
Well, and Zach, I guess one last thing I'll add to that is, you know, a lot of people in our finance and accounting team that, you know, handle these relationships on a day-to-day basis, you know, they've spent their careers cultivating relationships with the traditional financial service providers and banks. And so, you know, those relationships aren't particularly meaningful at this moment for the people in the industry. And so it's, you know, building those relationships with, you know, with guys like Tyler that they may not have had before, that takes time too. And so, you know, and you just don't have off the shelf things that you can go to that you've spent your whole life doing.
Yeah, I know we have maybe 5-10 minutes left, so I want to get to some questions, but I just want to clarify one thing. You know, Tyler, you mentioned, you know, for those that understand that don't know, so FinCEN puts out, I guess, either quarterly or biannually, you know, they're supposed to put out a report, and you know, it purports to identify the amount of banks that are banking in the cannabis industry. And, you know, what Tyler was touching on just a second ago with how many banks are there being really maybe, you know, 50 or less, is because the FinCEN report is based on how many banks are filing what's called the suspicious activity report. And the suspicious activity report, and Dana, correct me if I'm wrong on this, is in the simplest form, if there's any suspicious activity that would potentially violate the Bank Secrecy Act or any kind of AML or KYC or any financial regulations, something that would potentially send up a red flag for a bank, they have to file a report with the federal government on that. That's kind of the simple way. And so FinCEN puts out this and says, well, you know, 600 banks across the country are banking the industry because that's the amount of banks that filed SARs, or suspicious activity reports. And that's a misnomer, and it's a misleading, you know, fact that I think a lot of people in the industry don't realize, that just because, you know, B of A files a suspicious activity report doesn't mean B of A is banking in it. That means that B of A saw some investment come across its books that sent up a red flag because it dealt with cannabis. So with Tyler's point, that's something that's really important to understand, that there are banks that are doing it, whether they are state chartered credit unions or others, but they're not as many as you know, people think. It's just a matter of knowing the right industry people and knowing the right banks. I know we're running out of time, but I do want to get to some of the questions that we've seen. And if you do have questions, please throw them up in the Q&A. I'll try and run through them real quick. You know, an interesting question I see here is how, and I'll just throw this out to the group, anybody who wants to jump in. How important is compliance and specific banking software to the cannabis industry? I would say, how important is that, especially the software side, how important is it now, and how important do you think it will be post-federal legalization or descheduling? I'll throw it up to anybody.
It's extremely important. As Tyler said at the beginning of the session here, this will always be a heavily compliant industry. That's never going to stop regardless of federal legality. Because of the implications to the product itself. So I don't see the compliance issues lessening at all on that.
To Michael and to Tyler, you know, Michael, you touched on it before with technology side. How important is technology going to play moving forward for banking? And, you know, whether it's technology to help, you know, companies be more compliant, or even, you know, better versions of QuickBooks to, actually technology used to process payments? I mean, how important is that going to be moving forward, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, those will be huge parts of the solution. I mean, there are a lot, as Dana mentioned, I mean, there's the compliance is a critical piece. There's a lot of known barriers to entry in this space, a lot of known risks. Everyone's, ready to deal with them. And the more, easy to use technology that's there to navigate those known risks, the more providers that are there that are developing that technology is going to be helpful. But you kind of have the double whammy in an emerging industry where you have, the known risks and not a lot of tools to address them, or developing tools to address them. So as technology continues to emerge, as people get better at understanding the business and what it's going to take to successfully operate, whether that's cultivation, processing, retail side, any of those things, those are all going to be critical tools that companies will use that will help them, and help them be compliant, and also help banks and financial institutions understand the business.
I think on the banking side, I would argue this is as much a highly regulated industry problem as it is a cannabis problem. And the only conversation that matters is the conversation between the regulatory body and the financial institution. And so it gets back to the question of, can you make the most difficult and challenging accounts in your institution the most transparent? And if the answer is yes, and if technology can help with that, then you're going to win.
I guess to the group, are there things that state governments can do? I know we've seen, some states have tried to put forth, legislation that was, West Virginia had one, and, legislation that was, geared towards increasing banking access for the cannabis industry. Are there things that state governments can do beyond, really pressing federal governments that you guys think or know of?
So state bank will never happen, will never work. In every state that's proposed that legislation, it's gone down in flames for good reason. At the state level, we have seen state banking credit union regulators be problematic in a situation where a federal regulatory body is not. So states can come out with some kind of legislation that says they're going to support the industry. That is helpful. But at the end of the day, this is federal oversight. So there's very little they can do to help from a banking perspective in any state at the state level.
Interesting. I'm just kind of going through the questions. If anyone has any questions, please throw them up. Somebody wants to know if Hypur offers services that integrate with dispensary systems so that the consumer's perspective, Hypur is not visible. Does Hypur offer a white label system?
We fully integrate with many of the point of sale providers and the delivery providers. So fully integrated with both Jade and Dutchie, and I believe 12 different point of sale providers at this point.
Awesome. Well, I think, I'm not seeing many more questions, and I know we've touched on a whole slew of information, covering banking services, technology, payment processing, lending as well. I don't know if there's no more questions, I'm happy to stay on, but I want to thank our panelists. For those that don't know, we literally have some of the heaviest hitters when it comes to banking and the financial services industry in the cannabis sector. So we should all be extremely fortunate. I know I thank everyone from C-Lab, and thanking them for joining us, taking their time on a Thursday afternoon on a busy day. I really appreciate you all jumping on, and thank you for an amazing and thoughtful conversation.
Thank you.
For having us.
Thanks, everybody. Like I said, I'm happy to just stay on for a minute if anyone has any additional conversations or questions. I know Tyler, and I know I saw Tyler and Dana. I thought if everyone just wants to put and Mike, I saw as well, just put their contact info and also mine in the chat box. Be sure to save that before you go. And if you do have any questions, please feel free, reach out to me. I'm happy to help out. I know Dana and Tyler from working with them. I know they're always happy to talk to whoever they can and help out as best they can in the industry. I don't know, Amanda, if you're still on, if there's anything else we need to do or you'd like us to do, but we just want to thank everyone for watching and appreciate it.
Thank you.
No, I think we're good. Thank you, everybody, very much. We really appreciate all your time today. So thank you for coming out. Definitely drop your contact information. I know a lot of people want to connect with you. So.
Fantastic.
All right,
I
thanks, Zach.
think that's about it for today. Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Thank you.